and welcome to another wonderful presentation of the Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Speaker Series here at Saddleback College. I really appreciate you joining us this morning. And this morning we have, hold on, let's see. We have Dr. Ron McCurdy, who I will briefly say that I was the privilege to see him in action. Most of you know about my son, Stephen, because yes, Ron, I am a proud mother. And Stephen was part of the 2014 All-American College Band at Disneyland. And Ron was their director and has since been a mentor, not just to Stephen, but to hundreds of college musicians who have gone through that program. And I can say, Ron, it has been valuable lessons, life learning lessons that you have given them. So thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about Ron, and then we'll give him the floor. Dr. Ron McCurdy is the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Professor of Music in the Thornton School of Music at the University of Southern California, where he served as chair of the Jazz Department for 6 years. He served as a consultant to the Grammy Foundation and the Walt Disney All-American College Band. McCurdy continues to tour the Langston Hughes Project. This multimedia presentation is based on Hughes's poem, Ask Your Mama, 12 Moods for Jazz. In 2008, he premiered the orchestra version of the Langston Project and with the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, with rapper and television actor Ice-T. McCurdy has also created or co-created 2 other interdisciplinary productions, including Letters from Zora and Shanghai Jazz, a cultural mix. McCurdy is the co-author of The Artist Entrepreneur, Finding Success in a New Arts Economy. He is a co-author of a vocal jazz improvisation series titled Approaching the Standards. And then McCurdy also authored Meet the Great Jazz Legends. He contributed chapters to 2 recent publications, Teaching Music and Performance Through Jazz, Volume 1, and African Americans and Popular Culture. Dr. McCurdy is a performing artist for the Yamaha International Corporation as well. So, Dr. McCurdy, or Ron, welcome and take it away.
Eva Marie, thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction. As you were reading all of my accolades, I was thinking, boy, did I do all of that? But anyway, I'm so happy and honored, as a musician and an educator and historian and scholar. I think I have the best job on the planet because I have a chance to impact young people's lives like your son, Stephen, and many others. And I think that has been my true calling. And I have enjoyed and continue to enjoy a very robust career. So thank you for this invitation to have a chance to speak with the students here at Saddleback College. So here we go. Let me share my screen, if that's okay. We got 90 people here. Great, fantastic. I'm gonna share my screen and go to the slides. And there I am. Okay. When Dr. Rodriguez Morris asked me to do this, I'd given her a menu of topics, and she asked me to do from civil rights to the civil rights movement to rap music. And what I like to do this morning is to sort of give you a sense of how music and the arts, but specifically music, how music has been used to mitigate and disrupt racism. I hope that you will find this talk to be very informative. One of my favorite quotes that I like to use is from ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax, where he said that as we live, so do we sing. As we live, so do we sing. Now, what does that mean? It means politics, religion, economics, technology, all of those variables have an impact on how we live, and how we live dictates how we ultimately sing. And we're thinking metaphorically when he used that term. As we live, so do we sing. So we can look at all the things, all the events that have taken place historically, whether it be the Middle Passage of slavery. We can look at Emancipation Proclamation. We can look at the whole idea of the genocide of our Native Americans. We can look at the the taking over of land from our indigenous populations. We can look at World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, all those events, stock market crash, the invention of the internet. I mean, we can go back in history and look at things and how those instances have shaped who we are and what we are. So before we dive in, let me give you a little sense about who I am. As Eva Marie said, I'm professor, assistant dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion at USC in the Thornton School. But I'm also the son of two very, very wonderful parents. I was fortunate enough to have parents, both of whom were educated, and insisted that all of me and my siblings, that we also were educated. My father was a high school principal, and my mother taught third grade. We grew up in a town called Belle Glade, Florida. Now, my father moved to this town. This is a small farming town in South Florida. And when my parents moved there in 1946, the black schools in this particular town only went to the 5th grade. The thinking was, why should we, meaning the school board, why should we invest funds into educating these little black kids when they're going to end up doing exactly what their parents do, which is work in the fields? They picked corn, they picked cotton, they did all those kinds of things. They were very cheap labor. The top left picture gives you an example of what the housing situation was like for African Americans in this small town in the 1940s. The bottom photograph gives you an idea of just how torturous and how difficult the labor was to work in the sugarcane fields. This is what most of my friends who I grew up with in Belle Glade, this is what their parents did. And then the top right photograph says, "Welcome to Belle Glade, her soil is her fortune." Now, what that means is the soil was so fertile. For example, if you were to drop a seed into the ground on a Monday, by Thursday or Friday, you're going to see something growing up. That's just how fertile the soil was. And Florida, as you know, being a very tropical location, it rains all the time. So things are always being fertilized. Things grow very quickly. And so if you're going to have tens of thousands of acres of land, farmland, you need to have human beings, human labor to harvest the crops. And this is where the black population came into being in South Florida. My father, as I mentioned, was a high school principal. He recognized that education was going to be the key. So he knew Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the founder of Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona Beach, Florida. She knew Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady. And my father asked Mary McLeod Bethune, would she approach Eleanor Roosevelt to have her talk to her husband, who's the president, FDR, about allocating funding to allow the black schools to extend to the 12th grade. And by 1955, that had become a reality. And my father began to have what he called night school for the parents. They could receive their GEDs. He was very much an advocate of making sure that all kids had an opportunity to learn, because he recognized that education meant power. Education allowed one to have options in one's life. Most of my friends' parents didn't have options. What you're seeing at the bottom is what most of my friends' parents did. So anyway, those are my humble beginnings. I had great parents. I had other great mentors who helped me, which is why I think I'm at this point in my life, and in fact, long before I got to this point in my life, I have dedicated myself to paying it forward, to make sure that I can impart what I know to allow others to realize their dreams and goals. So again, so this morning we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, the emergence of the hip hop culture and rap music, and the cultural and social impact of hip hop. Now, I teach a class at USC called The Music of Black Americans. And in this particular class, we chronicle contributions of African Americans musically from 1619 to present, which is a long period of time. And we start out by talking about the importance of religion. And one of the things that I think is so powerful in all of this, we begin to see songs at a very early stage of our existence where songs were used to disrupt racism, but also in the case of the spiritual, was also designed to praise God. So the spirituals had a dual function. I mention this because this is the foundation of all Black music, is the Negro spiritual. Now, one might ask, well, how did that come to be? And it's not a simple answer, but when you look at this, the slave trade, or called the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade, you begin to see how Africans, those who came primarily from the west coast of Africa, were corralled, stolen from their homeland, and put into slavery, which is why I refer to them as being enslaved as opposed to being slaves. Enslaved as opposed to being a slave. And I mention that because that's so important, because African Americans' history does not start, or did not start, with us as being enslaved. In Africa, we were kings and queens, and we were thinkers, we were intellectuals, we were inventors, we were scientists, we did all those kinds of things. And having been enslaved, it disrupted the normal order of how one would have evolved, so to speak. So we see this situation now of how once slavery as an institution became in vogue, it became perhaps the cornerstone for New World economics. When you look at some of the countries throughout Europe, the British, the Portuguese, Spain, they were all involved at one time or another in the slave trade. They built their fortunes on the backs of slave labor. A few years ago, when the Queen passed away in England, and they had all the pomp and circumstance celebrating her life, and all the royalty came out, and we all felt sorry that she had passed away. But I kept thinking all that wealth was accumulated on the backs of enslaved Africans. America was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. By the time of the Civil War, the slave trade had generated more income than all the banks, railroad, and businesses combined in our country, which is why there were so many who were adamant about not ending it, because it was a free labor system. I should also point out that, contrary to what we read or see in some of the movies like Gone with the Wind or The Birth of a Nation, all those propaganda movies give the impression, particularly Gone with the Wind, that those individuals who were enslaved on the plantations were happy, were content being there. I want to make a statement right now, and I do this with my classes. At no point in history were enslaved Africans content and happy and jovial about being enslaved. That was not the case at all. And we can look back at certain moments in history. For example, in 1739, we can look back at what was called the Stono Rebellion. It's Stono for those who want to do a further investigation. Stono Rebellion. It was a group of Angolans who were warriors in their homeland. They were not accustomed to being enslaved. They broke away from the plantation. They went from one plantation to the next, gathering weapons and killing plantation owners and their families. They were trying to make their way to Florida because they had understood that if they made their way to Florida, that the British would set them free. They didn't quite make it. They were captured, surrounded up, and they were all executed, and they had their heads amputated. I mean, it was very gruesome. I hate to be so graphic this morning. I suspect some of you probably haven't had breakfast yet, but it was a very gruesome situation. And the word was, if you try and escape, the same thing will happen to you. But that did not by any means deter those who yearned to be free from trying to be free. We look back at Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner. These were all freedom fighters. Now back to the church situation. Enslaved Africans, there were groups of religious organizations, the Quakers, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the Methodists, Catholics. Many of these religious organizations were vigilant about converting enslaved Africans into Christians. And when we look at the church today, the largest institution within the Black community to this day in 2024 is the church. Many enslaved Africans could see themselves from the Old Testament Moses fleeing Pharaoh's army. They saw themselves in the same predicament. They could relate to that part of the Bible. And this is where they began to, as they were being taught hymns by the European church fathers and mothers, they would continue to put their own Africanness on these hymns. So you might get the song by John Newton, "Amazing Grace," being sung. In fact, by the way, John Newton was a slave ship captain himself, who saw the error of his ways. So when he said that saved a wretch like me in "Amazing Grace," he was talking about himself. So the song may have been taught to be sung, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," right? But that is not how enslaved Africans would sing that particular song. Because in Africa, music, dance, and poetry are inextricably connected. And there's no one word for music. Music, poetry, and dance is something that everyone participated in. So you ended up with the performance the performance was about the performer. That sort of what you might call personification of the music. So otherwise, like in European cultural music, you are designed to sing the song as it's written. You don't deviate from what's on the written page. In African-derived music, it's about the performer. So instead of getting "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," you get "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." You get that. Now, if they sing that same song 5 times in a row, more than likely it's going to be different each time they do it. We can see some of those same remnants of that in jazz. No self-respecting card-carrying jazz musician would play the song the same way night after night. The melody may be the same. If you're playing in a band where you have a written score, that would be the same. But eventually you're going to have the improvisational part, and that's where this comes in. So anyway, my point on all of this is that foundation of all Black music came from the Negro spiritual. And we see how enslaved Africans truly embraced Christianity. So we begin to see how this music became so important. Now, it didn't mean that they weren't just singing spirituals. Of course, there were secular songs as well. It was songs that were used for work songs, if you will, songs for just for frolicking and having, more non-working occasions, which were rare. But you found that the religion became the foundation for all this music. Let me move on. Now, the Civil Rights Movement didn't all of a sudden just happen in the 1960s. As I mentioned, we can go back and look at the 1739 Stonewall Rebellion. We can look at the uprisings that Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and many others did. We can also look at how there were all kinds of rebellious ways, things that would take place for those who found themselves enslaved to show their discontentment with being an enslaved African. However, there were a couple of moments in our history where things took a dramatic change. For example, Emancipation Proclamation that was enacted under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, in 1863, January 1st. Now, there was a little bit of hypocrisy in that whole Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln, we credit him as being the great emancipator, and he was. But Emancipation Proclamation only freed those enslaved Africans who came from slave or Confederate states. So if you were enslaved, let's say in Illinois or New York, Connecticut, Delaware, Vermont, Emancipation Proclamation had no impact on your life. You were still enslaved. It wouldn't be until after the Civil War with the 13th Amendment that freed all slaves, which is why we celebrate Juneteenth. It took 2 years after Emancipation Proclamation for those enslaved Africans in Texas, in the Galveston, Texas area, to be notified that 2 years later, you've been free for 2 years and didn't know it. So you have that kind of situation happening. And then you also look in our history, back to Lincoln again, when he freed the enslaved Africans, he said, if I can free some of the enslaved Africans, my goal is to keep the Union together. If I can free none of the enslaved Africans, again, my mission is to keep the Union together. Well, that didn't work out so well because South Carolina, where we'll be having the primary coming up, I guess next week rather, was the first state to secede from the Union, followed by North Carolina, then Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, Georgia, all begin to defect from the Union, and we launch into the Civil War. Now, what we see from this, we see, just as we saw in the Revolutionary War, African Americans were among the first to raise their hand to fight for freedom. We saw it with Crispus Attucks, who fought in the Revolutionary War. We saw it with the 54th Regiment from the Civil War. We saw it with the Hell Fighters in World War I. We saw it with the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. And of course, in all subsequent wars, we have always seen African Americans have been among the first to raise their hand to fight for freedom. One might ask, well, why would someone who's already enslaved feel compelled to pick up arms to fight for freedom that wouldn't be promised to them? And my simple response to that is they understood that sense of optimism, that maybe one day they would be free. And if I can fast forward for just a second, when we think about jazz music embodies the whole notion of what our government was supposed to be. We were supposed to be a democracy. Our founding fathers, all of whom were extremely brilliant, but we also recognize that 10 of the first 12 presidents owned human beings, they owned slaves. So you had Thomas Jefferson, one of the main architects of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. They grappled with, should we include the word slavery in our Constitution? And if you go back and read the Constitution, you will not find the word slavery anywhere in our Constitution. So when they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're referring to white men who are wealthy and who own land. If you were a poor white man or a woman or a person of color, those words did not pertain to you. And here we are in 2024, we're still fighting some of those same battles. Who is an American? Who gets to vote, right? Who gets to vote? Because again, we find situations where people say, well, you're not one of us. You shouldn't have a right to vote. In America, I shall tell you this, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, we began to see the first remnant of the country functioning the way that our founding fathers had written about, where one man or woman, one vote, although women still didn't have the right to vote. But African Americans could vote. And when they were allowed to vote, you had congressmen, you had senators, you had people involved in politics at all different levels, from the federal, state, region, local politics, people were involved. But then the Ku Klux Klan became energized. So we go from several 100,000 recently freed enslaved Africans voting to now just a few thousand because of the terrorism that was attached to the Ku Klux Klan. People were afraid to vote. If they voted, they could be killed. So they didn't vote. So again, we can see that yearning to be free. When we look ahead now to World War I, this is when the attitudes really begin to change. We begin to see the creation of the NAACP, the National Association for Colored People. We see the other organizations founded, the Niagara Movement, all of which was designed to fight for equal housing, the right to vote, the right to an education, the right to jobs. And does that sound familiar? Here we are in 2024, and we're still fighting some of those same battles. Nonetheless, after World War I, you had what was called the Harlem Renaissance. And you had individuals who, particularly soldiers who had fought in World War I, came back with a new sense of dare I say, vigilance in terms of demanding freedom. They would proudly wear the uniform, and often by wearing the uniform would also put a target on their backs, because a lot of times you would find veterans who fought in World War I lynched while wearing their uniform. So if you were to wear your uniform in public, you were basically putting a target on your back. Nonetheless, it did not deter African Americans from being much more vigilant about demanding their freedom. So that changed the whole complexion of our country. That also coincided with a thing called the Harlem Renaissance, which was primarily a literary movement, but it was also about individuals writing about the plight of African Americans. You had W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, Arnold Baumtop, all of whom were writing extensively about African Americans. And I would say that this was probably the first time in our country where African Americans were recognized for their intellect and not just their brawn, for picking beans and picking cotton and picking corn, what have you. They're now looked upon as intellectuals, talking about what they are experiencing. So that would be one of a turning point in our history. It also marked the second greatest migration of African Americans leaving the South and coming to the North. The first migration happened right after the Civil War in 1865. The second migration happened in the midst of World War I, or between 1914 and 1918. Now, what you see right now on the image here, this is 1965. We're going to fast forward. I even mentioned, I talked about my Langston Hughes Project, which I've been doing now for almost 20 years. And Langston Hughes, just to give you a sense of where we were in the country, he wrote this work. He wrote Ask Your Mama 12 Moves for Jazz in 1960. He had been asked to serve as the MC for the 1960s Newport Jazz Festival. And at that time, we were only 5 years removed from Emmett Till being murdered. We were 5 years removed from Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus. We were 5 years removed from a young, charismatic preacher from Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, named Martin Luther King. Some of you may have heard that name before. Had begun to gain momentum in being a soldier for civil rights. And so the whole idea of being docile and accepting one's fate was not the way. And we can look to many of those. We always celebrate Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and some of the others, but there were literally thousands of individuals whose names have been lost to history, who played significant roles in being part of the fight for freedom. I should also point out that it wasn't just African Americans. If I can digress for just a moment, when we go back to Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, the women's suffrage movement, this was involving women fighting for the right to vote. Now, sadly, when women got the right to vote, it was only white women who were allowed to vote. Black women didn't receive the right to vote until many years later. I mention that because in all of these struggles for freedom and equality, you always had people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, people of different religions, were all coming together as one to fight for those kinds of freedoms. It's kind of what we saw when George Floyd was murdered 4 years ago, back in 2020. When you saw people from this became a global phenomenon. People from all over the world begin to protest what had happened to George Floyd. The same thing happened on a much smaller scale, maybe not globally, but maybe also globally. We begin to see individuals join the fight for African Americans. And once African Americans receive, with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Housing Act, those same freedoms begin to matriculate to other individuals who have been marginalized. So this particular image here, this is about the Edmonds Pettus Bridge March. Did you see the young man that's on the ground, right? I'll put my little cursor here, lying on the ground. That's John Lewis. He passed away maybe 3 years ago. He was a young man. You can tell he was probably in his 20s when this happened. He, among others, had crossed the Edmonds Pettus Bridge to fight for their right to vote. And they were met with, as you can see, with officers with billy clubs, tear gas, dogs, and this happened repeatedly. This was just one incident. Martin Luther King was known for, he understood this new media called television was coming into vogue. And he recognized how powerful it was for people to see images of how African Americans were being treated. I would venture to say if we had not seen and heard George Floyd on the ground with the police officer with his knee on his neck, and we could hear him crying out for his mother, crying out for him saying, "I can't breathe." If we hadn't seen that, keeping in mind where we were 4 years ago, we were all at home, the pandemic was raging, and they were seemingly showing that clip on a loop You couldn't turn your television on without seeing George Floyd on the ground, handcuffed with the cop with his knee on his neck. If we hadn't seen those images, I don't know that we would have had the same kind of response. Trayvon Martin, we didn't see him being murdered. We heard about it after the fact. But imagine if we had seen Mark Zimmerman, I think his name was Zimmerman, who had killed Trayvon Martin. Imagine if we had seen that. So this particular scene that we're seeing right now, there were television cameras who showed how the police officers on horseback, billy clubs, tear gas, who basically just physically accosted those who were peacefully protesting. They weren't rioting, they weren't trying to burn anybody's building down. They were simply walking, protesting for the right to vote. I have a quick video I want to share with you right now. Skip ahead here.
With nightsticks, and I was standing and people were running because they were beating them. I did not run, so he hit me at the base of my neck, and I became unconscious.
Photos of a woman tear-gassed and beaten unconscious by Alabama state troopers are among the most iconic images of the civil rights movement. The woman was Amelia Boynton Robinson, a leader of the campaign for black voting rights in Selma, Alabama, and the first black woman to seek a seat in the US Congress from that state. She had helped organize a demonstration on March 7, 1965, to protest the killing of a young African-American church deacon named Jimmy Lee Jackson by an Alabama state trooper, and to continue the fight for voting rights. The Selma establishment was known to be among the most egregious in barring blacks from the polls. But what started as a peaceful protest ended with unspeakable violence. The veteran activist clearly recalls the events of that day, and she recently recounted them to middle school students in Los Angeles.
Under Dr. King, we decided that what we need to do is to have a bill that would let Negroes become registered voters. We were going to march from Selma, Alabama, which is on the river bridge, to Montgomery. I was near the front at the beginning. They came with horses. They came with nightsticks, and I was standing and people were running because they were beating them. And then he hit me on my shoulder. I did not run, so he hit me at the base of my neck, and I became unconscious.
Very difficult to listen to this and watch this. But what this shows, it just shows just how vigilant people knew that they were putting themselves in harm's way. But their idea and their desire to want to vote and to be looked upon as a citizen and as an equal superseded their concerns about being physically harmed. Very tragic moment, but these were seminal moments in the civil rights movement. And this wouldn't end. I mean, there were, as you know, there were a plethora of movements, demonstrations, situations where people were being killed, were being injured. We know about the four young men who were fighting for freedom fighters who disappeared. They found their bodies in the bottom of a river a few days later. So there were many courageous people who put their lives on the line to fight for freedom, justice, and equality. We've heard this speech before. This was 1963.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
And this was just before, I think, like the night before he before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King. Moving ahead. We see other examples. The term Jim Crow, for those who don't know that, Jim Crow was a relic from a theatrical performance called minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy. And the routine was called Jump Jim Crow. It was an enslaved African by the name of Jim Crow, who was owned by a Mr. Crow. And Jim Crow had a physical deformity. He would do this little jig dance he would do. And King Daddy Rice, who was the father of blackface minstrelsy, Thomas Dartmouth Rice was his name, built a whole performance based on this physically deformed enslaved African's routine. And people would come from miles around to see his Jump Jim Crow. And the name Jim Crow became synonymous with any black person. You know, no matter what your name was, Jim Crow, go get me that wheelbarrow. Jim Crow, go fetch that corn over there. So that became part of what became Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a term that was used to identify anybody who was African American. So we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act also in 65, Rosa Parks, Montgomery bus boycott. So you're seeing people become much more assertive. This is Governor Faubus. He was the governor of Arkansas, a staunch segregationalist. And in fact, there's a song called Fables of Faubus that was done by a famous jazz musician. And it was talking about Governor Faubus and how he wrote in his sign against racial integration of all schools within the Little Rock School District. And he was adamant about that. Then we begin to see artists like Nina Simone sing about songs about Mississippi. Now, she's gonna say the first lyrics that comes on. She will say, "Alabama's got me so upset." If you've been following the news the last couple of days, Alabama has just done something very atrocious in terms of women's reproductive rights. Listen to this very quickly.
Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest. And everybody knows about Mississippi gone down. Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi gone down. Can't you see it? I know you can feel it. It's all in the air. I can't stand the pressure much longer. Somebody say a prayer. Alabama's got me so upset, and Governor Wallace has made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi gone down.
All right. You can see she didn't pull any punches there. Fast forward now to the 60s and early 70s. Gil Scott-Heron, which was a precursor to rap music, he did a song called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And he's talking about now how things that were happening in the world, we won't find those things on television. Check this out very quickly.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruption. The revolution will not be televised.
And this is a precursor to rap music. Now, rap music, it was started in the Bronx, up in New York, early 1970s. And it was sort of the beginning, well, I shouldn't say the beginning, but it was part of white flight, particularly in some of our urban areas. And in the Bronx in particular, in Brooklyn, in that area, you had whites who owned banks and school districts and businesses begin to flee to move out to the suburbs, which in turn allowed for the cities to sort of become decayed. So you have at that time, roughly 50% or more unemployment among young African American males. Schools were horrible. Housing, jobs, education was dilapidated. It was just an impoverished situation. And so the whole idea of hip hop and rap music became a way of dealing with the vicissitudes of life. My colleague Trisha Rose from UCLA says, hip hop, first of all, hip hop is a culture, rap is the music. But a culture form that attempts to negotiate the experiences of marginalization, brutally truncated opportunity, and oppression within the culture imperatives of African American Caribbean history, identity, and community. It became an expression. I go back to my earlier statement, as we live, so do we sing. Because those opportunities were not available to many of those young people in particular, they found ways to be creative. Now, thinking about music, well, when the schools fell apart, there's no more band, there's no more choir, there's no more orchestra, there's no extracurricular activities. So you had young people who were always creative, had to figure out ways to come up with how do I remain, how do I remain creative? But I don't have a trumpet, I don't have a piano, I don't have drums. So we begin to see this whole idea of poetry. In many ways, it's a throwback to African culture known as the griots. The griots were individuals, talking about Africa now, the griots were individuals who were able to recount the deeds of kings and queens in a very poetic fashion, extemporaneously. We would call that freestyling today. This is what African griots could do. So we begin to see that same kind of thing happening with the emergence of rap music. We have basically four pillars. We have the breakdancers, top right. We have the graffiti, top left. We have the MC, bottom left, and we have the MC, bottom right. These are the four ingredients. The MC, those who are chanting, rhyming, rhythms, what have you. DJing, the ones who spun the records, the turntables. The b-boying and g-girling are the break dancers. And the break come from how rap artists, who the DJs learn how to take a song and just highlight the percussion part, the percussive part of it, just the breakdown of the drum beat, not just the singing or the horns or what have you, but just the drum beat. This was called the break, hence the term break dancing. And then from a visual artist standpoint, you get those who were very creative, who were able to draw. In fact, we see it as we're driving on the 110 freeway of the 405, and we go past a bridge overpass, and we see this artwork on the bridge. That's graffiti. That comes from this particular era, where young artists begin to draw and leave their mark, if you will. One of the fathers of rap music and hip hop culture is Africa Bambaataa. DJ Kool Herc, Copeland Rock, Grandmaster Flash, and many others. Now, from a financial standpoint, they were probably born about 50 years too soon. From a financial standpoint, because at this time, there was virtually no commercial value at all to rap music. None. It was more of a cathartic experience to allow those to be engaged, just to be creative and have block parties. People, they would rent out maybe the clubhouse at an apartment building or somewhere to have people come and dance, but there was no money being made. People were just spinning records. This also happened to be where people were, because a lot of these young rap artists and MCs did not write music. They didn't go to school. They didn't learn how to compose their own music. They begin to take other people's music, whether it be sampling or creating a mixtape, and which is why you find today, even now, some rap artists end up being sued because they just confiscate someone else's work without permission. That's called copyright infringement. we can look back at examples like, for example, MC Hammer with that boom, dum, 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 can't touch that, dum, 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 right? That song was Super Freak. I can't think of his name. I'm drawing a blank right now. Maybe somebody can tell me who it is. But he used that line without permission. Of course, he got sued, and the person who wrote that song ended up being paid for it. But Africa Bambaataa was a gangbanger. He had a pilgrimage to South Africa, to Zululand, and he came back with a different mindset. He said, we're going to refrain from killing each other. We're going to stop gang banging. We're gonna stop selling drugs, and we're gonna do something positive with our lives. And he did that. He came out with a song called Peace, Unity, Love, and Having Fun. Check this out.
Africa Bambaataa.
Soul Trap, y'all. Pump this up louder. Peace, unity, love, and having fun. Peace, unity, love, and having fun. Peace, unity, love, and having fun. Peace, unity, love, and having fun.
You can see it's a whole different mindset. We won't have time to do this right now, but this is another pioneer called Copeland Rock. He was very much involved in this as well. Now, something happened before we get there. I'm gonna go here and we'll come back to this one. We begin to see the Sugar Hill Gang in 1979 came out with a tune called Rapper's Delight. Now, prior to this song, still no one was making any money doing rap at all. But all of a sudden, you get this song comes out, and now everyone's dancing to it.
Here's Wonder Mike, Hank, and Master G, the Sugar Hill Gang.
The hip, how you don't stop. Bring it out, baby, rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat. Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. You see, I am Wonder Mike, and I like to say hello. Up to the black, to the white, the red, and the brown, the purple, and yellow. But first, I gotta bang bang, the boogie to the boogie, say up jump the boogie to the bang bang boogie.
Despite hip-hop's fast appeal.
What's so bizarre about this, Big Bang Hank was his name, was not a rap artist. He made pizzas, but he hung around rap musicians, and he basically kind of confiscated what other people were doing. And Sylvia Robinson, who was the owner of Sugar Hill Records, could foretell that rap was going to be a big money maker. So she was ahead of the curve. So she was looking for someone that could rap. She goes in to buy a pizza. She hears the guy making pizzas rapping to himself and says, "Oh, can you rap?" He goes, "Yeah. Come out to my car. I'm gonna put some beats on and have you rap." Now the irony, I'll share this video with you very quickly, but this tells the story of how Big Bang Hank, in a very peculiar way, became, I would say, infamous because he was not a rapper. Check this out very quickly.
In predominantly black neighborhoods on New York's all that was about in New Jersey to himself while preparing her food.
I was helping make pizza at the shop, and a woman by the name of Sylvia Robinson came to the pizza shop and they asked me, did I want to make a record? Picture this, I'm in the pizza shop, full of dough, flour all over me, and I'm going to audition to make a record. So I go into the back of her son's 98, and they have a cassette in the car, and I'm rapping along with the track. And she really enjoyed it. She said, okay, I'm going to use you on the record. And a week later, we did it. It was done in one take.
I said the hip, hop, the hip, to the hip, hop, you don't stop the rocker to the bang, bang, boogie, say up, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat. Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat.
Released in 1979, Rapper's Delight would become an enduring dance floor hit. But despite its massive commercial success, the song was greeted with scorn within the hip-hop community. They thought it was too soft.
When Rapper's Delight first came out, every, traditional rapper was fucking mortified. They was like, what the fuck are they doing with our, art form? It's like they axe murdered the shit. So, we didn't think that was creditable.
I got a color TV so I can see the Knicks play basketball. Him and talking about checkbook, cause it costs more money than a sucker could ever spend. but I wouldn't give a sucker off.
Another criticism of Rapper's Delight was that whole sections of Big Hank's lyrics bore an uncanny resemblance to rhymes previously performed by Bronx MC Casanova Fly.
I met Hank at a club called a Sparkle in the Bronx. We kind of clicked. And we used to talk about hip-hop and parties and stuff. He sounded like he had a good head. So I asked him to be down with us. People from Sugar Hill Records came in and he called me. He said, I want to use some of your rhymes. So I'm really not thinking. Okay? So I said, okay, all right, well, cool, whatever.
I'm the CASN, the OVA, and the rest is FLY. You see, I go by the code of the doctor of the mix. These reasons I'll tell you why.
The CASN, the OVA, and the rest is FLY. That's my name, spelled out, Casanova Fly. He didn't even change it to say Big Bang Hank or to say, he just rhymed the way it was in the book.
I can understand why he would say that, and
Now I'll play this for you because this, as I mentioned, from an economic standpoint, this is when rap music began to change. It was no longer about unemployment, about lack of education, lack of jobs, lack of being able to vote. It became party dance music. And Big Bang Hank basically confiscated Casanova Fly's lyrics as he's talking about right now. I mention this because this would push the music into a different arena where some of the true diehard rap artists refused to be a part of this kind of what they would call bubblegum rap music that didn't have any kind of social message to it. This is just party music. I'm gonna skip ahead now. I'm gonna go back to one. This is one by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five called The Message. And he's talking about what life is like in the ghetto.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Broken glass everywhere. People pissing on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise. Got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a tow truck repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head.
And this was a similar rap artist because he's describing the conditions in the ghetto. He's talking about drunkards in the alley with the baseball bat and people on drugs and strung out trash everywhere. He's describing this. He's giving us a sense of what his life was all about. Now, fast forward now, I want to go to some of the misogyny in rap. And this is important here because this is Queen Latifah. We know her as more of an actor, but her start was as a rap artist, and she's talking about how the lyrics in many of the rap songs have become quite misogynistic, and so she's talking about how we need to stop doing it, being part of that.
Who you calling a bitch? Flow. Every time I hear a brother call a girl a bitch or a hoe, trying to make a sister feel low, you know all of that gots to go. Now everybody knows there's exceptions to this rule. I don't be getting mad when we playing, it's cool, but don't you be calling me out my name. I bring rap to those who disrespect me like a dame. That's
one thing that Duke Ellington said. He said, whenever art and commerce collide, usually the art will be compromised. What Africa Bambaataa did and Grandmaster Flash and others talking about the conditions of their lives, that would be considered art. But when you're talking about some misogynistic topics, things that have nothing to do with the human existence other than belittling and berating women, that's a whole different ball game. And that became, if I can go back to, I was talking about minstrelsy earlier, we can go back and look at examples and do the comparison of how minstrelsy was a very demeaning portrayal of African Americans. We can see the through line from minstrelsy to what we call misogynistic rap music, where you're demeaning people and you're talking about killing each other. But this was what sold. We know that there were certain producers, particularly white producers, the artists would bring their rhymes in, and they would be told, this is not edgy enough. This needs to be edgy. And edgy became a code word for misogyny. And because that would sell. Talking about unemployment, housing, education, or lack thereof, that had become passé. What's selling now is the belittling of women. And sadly, we find the same, we find that other women begin to embrace the same kind of ideology that some of the men were doing. We can look at people like Lil' Kim. We can look at who did Anaconda, Nicki Minaj and others, who are very explicit about their sexuality and their desires. So, but this is what sells. So we can see how the music has sort of lost its way from a standpoint of addressing some of the issues that were important. I'm gonna skip ahead now, and my last slide will be, this is Her. Many of you might be familiar with Her. She was on the Grammys a couple of weeks ago, wrote a tune called I Can't Breathe. Listen to this for just a second. I'm gonna skip ahead.
Starting a war, screaming peace at the same time. All the corruption and justice, the same crimes. Always a problem if we do or don't fight and we die. We don't have the same right. What is a gun to a man that surrenders? What's it gonna take for someone to defend her? If we all agree that we're equal as people, then why can't we see what is evil? I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me.
Trying times all the time. Destruction of minds, bodies, and human rights. Stripped of bloodlines, whipped and confined. This is the American pride. It's justifying a genocide, romanticizing the theft and bloodshed that made America the land of the free. To take a black life, land of the free, to bring a gun to a peaceful fight for civil rights. You are desensitized to pulling triggers on innocent lives because that's how we got here in the first place. These wounds sink deeper than the bullet your entitled hands could ever reach. Generations and generations of pain, fear, and anxiety. Equality is walking without intuition, saying the protector and the killer is wearing the same uniform. The revolution is not televised. Media perception is forced down the throats of closed minds, so it's lies in the headlines and generations of supremacy resulting in your ignorant, privileged eyes. We breathe the same and we bleed the same, but still we don't see the same. Be thankful we are God-fearing because we do not seek revenge. We seek justice. We are past fear. We are fed up eating your shit because you think your so-called black friend validates your wokeness and erases your racism. That kind of uncomfortable conversation is too hard for your trust fund pockets to swallow. To swallow the strange fruit hanging from my family tree because of your audacity to say all men are created equal in the eyes of God, but disparage a man based on the color of his skin. Do not say you do not see color. When you see us. We can't breathe.
Yes. I will conclude by saying, as young people, I suspect most of you on the call this morning are in college, that you have a fiduciary responsibility to, when you see something, to say something. You have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the people who are in your space, that you interact with on a daily basis, that you check people when you hear someone tell a racist joke or say something demeaning to a woman, or say something that's unkind to someone from our LGBTQ plus community, or someone who's Muslim who's wearing a hijab. You have to say something, because one thing that I do understand about our founding fathers, they gave us an amazing blueprint. if only we would follow it. If only we would adhere to the words that they gave us as a country where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people, not gender, all people are created equal. If we can do that, then we can make a difference. But it starts with education. And I think understanding your history, American history, and some of it's not so pleasant. I mean, we have moments where things weren't so nice and kind, but we can't begin to heal until we tell the truth, until we address that history. So I'm going to pause at this point. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, but I want to say thank you again to Eva Marie and the members of the whole committee who invited me to be a part of this. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was so enlightening. And we have several questions coming in. One I think would be kind of good to get started is that, you talked about how your parents knew the importance of education, and you had mentioned that they also themselves were educated. How was that process for that? I mean, how did they get their education? And
they were lucky. They were fortunate because after the Civil War, we began to see the emergence of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities.
Yeah.
And these schools gave African Americans an opportunity to receive an education beyond high school. And both my parents went to Florida A&M University, which is where I went to school for college, for undergrad work. And I think my father and my mother's parents, neither of whom were educated. My grandmother on both sides of my family, none of them went past the 4th or 5th grade. But they made sure that their kids, like even my brother, my father's siblings, he had 8 brothers and sisters. Only 3 of them actually went to college. So, and my mother only had 1 brother. He didn't go to college. So, they were the first in their family to go to receive an education, and they understood the value of an education. They understood how important it was that you be able to speak well, that you were able to learn and have ideas and be critical thinkers. They understood that. So we had, to give you an example, we would have homework year round in the McCurdy household. My father would have us writing term papers and doing research and doing oratorical presentations all the time, year round. So for me, school was never out.
So you definitely a lifelong learner for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And yes, and for mentioning, the HBC, right? I want to make sure I get that one. Yes. And their role, because I know that's a whole nother set of history that can parallel what you talked about. And then also going back towards the beginning, because you had mentioned that with music, especially coming from Africa, that the music, the dance, and the poetry were all intertwined.
Yes.
And I love that, because it almost is like, truly, that's like the triple threat, right? Now, but it was more about the performer. So in these communities, would they have like their stars that everybody would go and hear? Did they have followings? Or is it more that didn't exist because it was about more community?
Exactly. In Africa, everybody sang, everybody danced, everyone was involved in some form of poetry. There's no word in African languages to describe a musician, because everybody did music. Everybody sang, everybody danced. So which is why in our country we have our designated singers. Sometimes if I ask people in my class to sing, they go, "Oh no, I don't really sing." Yes, you do. Everybody sings. I mean, there are different levels of, but everybody can sing. So in an African culture, everyone was involved in that, which is why there were songs that were just for children. There were songs for adolescents. There were songs for women, songs for men, but everyone participated.
Excellent. Well, and then because of that sense of everyone participating, I guess that sense of community, which I think a community that can tie to each other through music and dance and poetry, those are some pretty strong bonds.
Absolutely.
I feel. Is that how they learned this sense of optimism that you had mentioned? That because that I guess came over here to the United States, I mean, where would that have been learned?
Well, I think the optimism came with the desire to be free. Now, we're talking about a different dynamic in Africa because they already were free. I mean, they were just living their lives, but
now they're here.
Which is why I always say, I tell my students the reason why jazz started in America, because jazz represents the greatest example of democracy. And that whole idea of religion, believing in something, having this intrinsic desire to be free, and to recognize, they bought into the whole idea of heaven and hell, of having the afterlife. And so many of the spirituals talked about life after death. One day I'm going to be free of this bondage. One day I will be free. But that spoke primarily to the afterlife. But there were many who thought, well, I want my freedom now. I don't want to wait till I'm gone to be happy. I want to be happy while I'm here on earth. Mm-hmm. So there were those who just believed that if they just kept praying and kept working and kept fighting for freedom, they would eventually get it. And that's the same, that same ethos is a part of how jazz music functions. Improvisation, I, the me, swing, the we, what we all can do collectively, and then the blues, that sense of optimism, where we know, in the words of Kendrick Lamar, we're going to be all right. Mm-hmm. It may be cloudy today, but we know tomorrow the sun's going to come out. We're going to be all right. We're going to keep fighting until we achieve that level of freedom. So that spirit was there. Now, I would be untruthful if I said that everybody felt that way. Everybody did. There were some people who weren't as vigilant about their freedom as others. But the vast majority, they yearned to be free. And that optimism is what kept them moving forward. It's what kept the 54th Regiment to want to fight in the Civil War. It's what kept Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King fighting for freedom.
Thank you for that. You showed us, and I think we all know in this class, especially for me, teaching art history, the importance of image, of the image. And you do bring out a good point of the difference between Trayvon Martin and George Floyd, the images that we see that permeate in the bigger public, I guess, in the eye. But I want to kind of go back to a little bit with the music that you shared with us about Nina Simone's. Oh, man. When I first heard that, yes, I thought I have a problem with Alabama right now. But, where would her audience be? Where would she be able to play music like that, in her day? I mean,
well, she was very popular in the 1960s as well. She was very much involved in the civil rights movement. She had intended to be, her first goal was to be a concert pianist, but she was never admitted to any of the conservatories where she could study. So she never pursued that. And so her career took a different turn and she became an activist. So her concerts, she would do those songs at her concerts. People loved her songs. I wanted to play that song "Strange Fruit" by Billie Holiday. Another powerful song that's very descriptive of what was happening in terms of African Americans being lynched. But Mississippi Goddamn, I mean, it's the kind of song that just, it shows the level of frustration. It's like, doggone it, I can't believe what y'all are doing. You have the audacity to do this to other human beings? This is what she was basically saying, calling people out.
So then now let's go fast forward, because before or between that period of time, perhaps, and then before peace, unity, love, and having fun, I mean, what was there for young people to listen to? And more importantly, what were they able to have something to express themselves? That we find rap music, in its purest form, was a vehicle for self-expression.
Exactly. And that's all they had. I mean, they were poor. Their infrastructure was crumbling around them. Their schools were horrible. I mean, it was a very dystopian time in our history. And so the music became a cathartic experience, and again, people like Africa Bambaataa, who recognized that I've got to change my ways. I got to stop this gang banging. I got represent my people in a more positive way. And so he began to use these, like the example that we saw, he began to have these kind of street parties or these gatherings where people would sing and dance and have a nice little beat. And you saw the DJ in the back spinning the records and people dancing. But that's where the optimism came from. From a formal training standpoint, you didn't have any of that. I mean, there was no one going to school to learn how to do that. I mean, they were just telling their own stories. People would say that, that rap music initially became the CNN in the Black community because they're rapping about what's happening in the community.
Oh, I love that image, the CNN of the Black community. Yes, for sure. So here's a question that came in. Does rap music have to be composed like lyrics, like on a musical beat?
Well, the whole idea, I played the example, the revolution will not be televised by Gil Scott-Heron. That's a precursor to rap. And what he was saying, it didn't rhyme. It didn't necessarily fit with the music. The music was more like a background while he was rapping. But now most rap artists, the beat, they're rapping to a particular tempo, to a certain rhythmic pulse. So the answer to that question, yes. You find, in fact, when I was playing the one example, it's like a jungle. Sometime I have to keep from to keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. So the beat is going along with that. So that line has to fit within that rhythmic time structure. So yes, and we begin to see that other artists begin to sort of deviate from that. But for the most part, rap, there was a real correlation, a rhythmic correlation between the lyrics and the rhymes and the music and the backtracks. Yes.
So then in the beginning, they're just doing this, right? They're more or less speaking from the heart, right? They're making this music. And like, I mean, I can't imagine a more humble beginning than you're making pizza and you're also, creating rap music. So has it become formalized? I mean, was there a point where all of a sudden it's like, okay, we are now going to teach you how to rap? Or is it's always kept this free spirit?
Still kind of a folk music, yeah.
Oh.
Now I will tell you that there are courses like at Berklee College of Music. They have courses in what they call turntablism, where you learn how to scratch. But I think rap music in many ways it's kind of like jazz again. I mean, I know we have jazz programs, and most of the programs are pretty good. But I can always tell the people who learn to play in the street and in church versus those who learn from a book. I can hear the difference in the way they play and or the way they sing. And so I think I think rap is kind of in that same category. I don't know how you would, I don't know how you would formalize teaching rap because it's such a personal, it's your story.
Right.
Maybe there are techniques that you can learn in terms of how you might go about rhyming. I don't know, but I haven't seen very many programs where they've tried to sort of turn it into an academic or scholarly exercise. Like people that we revere, the Kendrick Lamar's, the Chance the Rappers, they didn't go to school to learn how to rap.
Well, in a way, I'm so happy to hear that because to me, it also allows, to me, that shows a certain level of respect. Am I being too naive when I say that shows a certain level of respect to the origins of this music? That it's still allowing people that freedom of expression?
Well, I think those who try to academize the music, they probably won't go very far. They'll be called out as an imposter, kind of like how Big Bang Hank was. Now, Big Bang Hank, what he did was basically steal Casanova Fly's lyrics verbatim. He was not creative at all. He was basically just mimicking what he had already heard.
Right.
So I would imagine he probably didn't have the skill to come up with his own rap lyrics. So he had to steal Casanova Fly's lyrics. So I think there's a certain degree of authenticity that's involved in rap. And I went to see Common was at USC earlier this week. He did a talk about his new book, and just to hear how he grew up, how he began to sort of rhyme and write about the things that he saw in his community, and he got good at it. Did it all the time. And but he didn't go to school to learn how to do that. He just was observant of his surroundings, and he began to rap.
That's well, and that leads right into this next question that came in. It's all art forms are influenced by other forms and artists. How do you help your students understand how to distinguish between copying and be inspired by others' work?
Good question. That's a very good question. And thanks whoever sent that question in. It's difficult because just like when you're learning how to speak, you listen, you analyze, and you imitate. Eventually, you want to get beyond the imitating phase of your journey to a point where you become a composite of others. Like in the case of Common, he listened to a Tribe Called Quest when he was young, growing up. That became one of his mentors. And eventually he went in his own direction. But I think the whole idea is you have to at least do your homework to understand where the music, or in this case, where the rap lyrics, how they evolved. And then you put your own spin on it. It's like having your own fingerprint. Like no two people have the same fingerprint. You've got to figure out, what is your voice? What is your message? What are you trying to say? And some people just have a knack at being able to do that. I mean, in the case of Common and others, Snoop Dogg and people like that, I mean, they work just as hard as any classical pianist or jazz musician works on their craft. They work equally as hard on their particular craft. You know?
That's excellent. Thank you. Here's another great, interesting question. If commercialization is marginalizing the message of hip hop, where is music going to keep the message alive? Or even to say, how is music going to keep the message alive?
If I could answer that question, I would be a very wealthy man. We don't know. But you know, I think what happens, we have a way of weeding out the things that are shallow. For things that don't have substance, there may be a flash in the pan, and they may even win a Grammy. But eventually we realize this person doesn't have the substance that other people would have. You know, I mean, there's a reason why we still listen to Duke Ellington. There's a reason why we still listen to Louis Armstrong. You know, because there's substance there. But I think you know, as a practitioner, I think you can only do you. You can only do who you are, and when you create your art, you're not doing it with the idea, well, people will like this versus that. They'll like A versus B. When you do that, that's a kiss of death. You've already sort of sold part of your soul to the devil, because you're trying to second guess what people will like and what they may not like. You have to. A true artist will create and put it out there. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, then that's on you. I think that kind of like Tracy Chapman. Tracy Chapman, you know, who sang at the Grammys a couple of weeks ago, "Driving in a Fast Car." That song is so creative. I mean, that guitar lick at the beginning is so iconic. The moment you hear it, you can envision the story that she's about to tell. That's a stroke of genius. You know? So, and those kind of songs don't come around very often. And that song was written over 20 years ago, and people still. I mean, it was probably the reason why the Grammy ratings were so high, because people just love watching and seeing her sing that song that she wrote 20 years ago.
Definitely. That's I think a great example of how certain songs are just timeless.
Yes.
You know, and we seem to all, and with that, we seem to all have what I like to call music memory.
Yeah.
Because where you turn on that song, either the first time you heard it, or maybe somebody you were with. But yes, that's a great example. Well, yeah. What do you kind of going down another road, what do you think of white rappers like Eminem and McSilroy?
I feel the same way about them as I do about white jazz musicians. If you're good, you're good.
It's all about the music, right?
It's about the music. I mean, when you think about jazz, was a genre that was initially, I mean, African Americans were the primary progenitors of the music, but musicians, particularly jazz musicians, during that particular time, were way ahead of the social curve. It wasn't about the color of your skin. It's like, can you play or can you sing?
Yeah.
You know, so we look at people like Jerry Mulligan, great white saxophone player. We look at people like others who were just phenomenal musicians, but they happened to be white. And the musician said, hey, come on in, you're welcome. So same thing, on the verse side, you look at people like Benny Goodman, who hired Lionel Hampton, who was African American, being his band, not because he was black, because he could play. He wanted him in his band. So I think music has always been ahead of the curve, you know, the social curve when it comes to that whole racial and ethnic backgrounds of people. It's about the music.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think at a certain level that those have a trained ear to because I would imagine there would have to be some sort of authenticity about their music.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in jazz, right?
Exactly.
Now authenticity comes with your skill level. Boy, you know, you can play, yes, I will sit with you and come join our group.
Yes.
Right. So here's an interesting question too. As a child of the 70s, listening to Rapper's Delight made me wonder how much disco was influential in hip hop or rap, or was disco influential?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the whole idea of the DJ came out of the whole disco movement. And of course, the disco movement up in New York, Club 54 was primarily, you know, in fact, the movie Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. Some of you may remember that movie, Saturday Night Fever, with the song by the Bee Gees and all that, all the dancing and all that kind of stuff that was going on. That movie was the antithesis of what actually was happening. The disco movement was spearheaded primarily by African American and Latino gay men. It was underground music, it was house music, club music. People were coming and having a good time. But the movie gave a whole different spin. They had John Travolta painted as this virile heterosexual who had 2 or 3 women hanging off his shoulders all night long at the dance club. That's not how disco evolved. But from a musical standpoint, disco was about the DJ. That person their task was to keep the record spinning and to keep one song morph into another song to keep people on the dance floor. And rap, again, embraced the whole notion of having a DJ, but then all of a sudden they added another component. They added the MC, and that's where the rap part came from.
Excellent. I'm just soaking this all in. This is just so intriguing and such a different lens to look through this music. So is there a point though where these rappers I guess get the label, or I don't know if it's a label, but they become mainstream? So one student writes, you know, how does John Batiste fit into this narrative? You know, is he mainstream now? I mean,
well, John's not a rapper. First of all, John's an extraordinary musician,
right?
Because he plays classical piano, he plays jazz, he's a singer-songwriter. So I wouldn't classify him as a rap artist.
Okay.
But I would say that you look at rap artists like Snoop Dogg, for example, and Ice-T. These guys were gangbangers, selling and doing drugs. Now they're on TV talking about getting car protection. You know.
Yeah.
And you see Snoop Dogg with what's her name, who does all the homemaking stuff? The woman
Martha Stewart.
Martha Stewart.
Yes.
I mean, what a disparate combination. I mean, so they're different because in many ways they become corporate. You know, I don't know that will ever happen to Kendrick Lamar or Chance the Rapper. Common, who I just saw earlier, he's become an actor. Queen Latifah become an actor. But their start was in rap music. I mean, that's where they started. But they expanded their portfolio, as it were. Yeah.
So actually, that brings up a good question that I just thought of. What did you think about the Super Bowl halftime a couple years ago when you have Snoop Dogg, you know, performing to a world audience?
It was fine. I mean, it was all right. I mean, Super Bowl halftime shows, that's about ratings. That's not about art.
True. Yes, true.
You know what I mean? So I have to look at it through a different lens. If I'm looking at it through a lens of I want to be entertained, I want to be stimulated intellectually, artistically, that wouldn't do much for me. Now, somebody else who's into that, they might enjoy it. I mean, I'd have been happy to have seen or Harry Connick Jr. or
Me too.
or someone, or any of the vocalists, but those kind of people would never be on a Super Bowl because they're trying to cater to a certain market. And so I'm at a point right now where I always tell people, do you, do what you like to do. I mean, as long as you're not hurting anybody, do you.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So, one student writes, so interesting background I never knew. Where can we get more of this? If somebody wants to kind of learn more about this, is there a book you can recommend, or is it some?
There's a book that I bought my son called, there's a book that came out, I can't think of the title of it now, but it was the 50 years of hip hop. There's a whole book that sort of explains the whole evolution of hip hop. But I would say, go to Romans or any bookstore and just spend the afternoon there. When I was a young professor and trying to learn this history, which I did not know. I mean, I haven't always been this smart. I mean, I had to study, I had to read. So I would challenge it, just to be curious and ask questions like, okay, where'd this come from? Why is this happening? What's the through line between George Floyd and Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Emmett Till, Eric Garner? What's the through line there? Why that kind of history happen? What does and I would say to young people, try to be aware of what's happening right now, because I had in one of my classes years ago, I told students, you all now are 18 years old, you're able to vote. Your vote will make a difference. I said, and this was before Roe v. Wade was repealed. I said, your voting can make a difference in terms of who's going to be in the White House. And who's in the White House gets to pick the Supreme Court. If they pack the court with people who are very conservative, it's going to change. Rights will be taken away that you've had for the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say to young people, just try to be engaged. Like know what's happening in Russia right now. Know that Alexei Navalny, who was just murdered in a prison in Moscow, know who he was and what he stood for. Understand what's happening with the House and the Senate and politics. Those things have an impact on your life. You can't just kind of just coast through life and not understand what's going on around you, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you may end up being the meal. You don't want that to happen. So you need to be informed. And I don't sound like an old guy talking like this, and I would tell my young people who are listening right now, when I was your age and thinking you guys were probably 19, 20 years old, I didn't think this way. I didn't. Wish I had, but I didn't. I was in college in 1974 when Nixon was pardoned, was about to go to jail for Watergate. That meant nothing to me when I was in college. Didn't even think about it. But now I think, wow, I was alive when that happened. I remember Watergate. I remember people talking about it, but I didn't understand what it was all about. So I would just say, if you can get ahead of that kind of thing, where you understand the history, that'll serve you well. I got to run. My meeting started 30 minutes ago. So.
No problem. But let me just say, I want to thank you. And then I'm going to email you. Perhaps you can share a clip of something of you performing.
Sure.
But I'll email you that, to just a link.
You can go online. You can go online and just click Langston Hughes Project, and you'll see. Okay. I've got a gazillion videos that you can just download and just use it as you see fit.
All right. Well, I know we have the website or the link to that website also in our Canvas shell. Yeah. So, Ron, thank you so much for sharing with us this important, having us learn more about this important genre of music that's part of our American history.
It is.
For sure. And so we appreciate your time. Everyone, thank you for coming today. And have a great week, everybody. And we'll see you next Friday.
All righty. Thank you, Eva. Bye-bye now, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Ron.